Chapter 11, God or the Ego. Let us today be children of the truth and not deny our holy heritage. As was stated in the first chapter of our text, you respond to what you perceive, and as you perceive, so shall you behave. The Golden Rule asks you to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This means that the perception of both must be accurate. The Golden Rule is a rule for appropriate behavior. You cannot behave appropriately unless you perceive correctly. Since you and your neighbor are equal members of one family, as you perceive both, so you will do to both. You should look out from the perception of your own holiness to the holiness of others. According to what we learned in chapter 2, Jesus wants us to follow our bliss, which is thoughts that align with God's will, that we be happy. When we are not joyous and have lost our peace of mind, our big S self is telling us that we are not in alignment with right-mindedness. What the ego is presenting at these times is meaningless, and so we learn to minimize the time that we're willing to suffer as victim of ego separating thoughts. We cannot accept the atonement for ourselves partially. Unless we give our allegiance totally to the Holy Spirit, we will remain trapped in fear. Partial denial of our birthright is total denial. In the illusion of time and space, we can pretend there are exceptions to truth, but this lie will keep us trapped in the insanity of wrong-mindedness. So watch your mind for the temptation of the ego, and do not be deceived by the temptations of the ego. The ego's temptations offer you nothing. Everything is useful for learning about God's certainty. Nothing else is real. Misidentification is a mistake. In fact, misidentification is an authority issue. We'll learn that our confusion about God's certainty is the indirect cause for all our problems. This is also why we must learn about God's certainty by indirect means. When we make a mistake, we can learn to use the next moment for a return to peace and the joy and healing strength of God's certainty.
And so I'm going to cut over here to the actual lesson 167 instead of go through it just as it is in the handout. I'll include the email, which will include both the link to the lesson 167 and also the extract from lesson 167 is in here in the presentation as well. But I decided I wanted to actually go through the entire lesson, and I'm going to stop it occasionally a couple times to do a little bit of additional explanation. It's important that we realize to continue with being able to make the kinds of decisions that are right-minded and to have the kind of day we want. It's important that we just reinforce as much as possible, or as much as needed at least anyway, that we should look out from the perception of our own holiness to the holiness of others. So we don't have to perceive outside ourselves a holiness about others, but we must remain within ourselves able to look out from our holiness to see the holiness of others. So in other words, what they do in the world outside of ourselves doesn't really matter. What we choose to do instead of seeing upsets, worries, frustrations, regrets, and so on about what we perceive in the world outside ourselves, instead of doing that, we take that into our realization of the increasing truth, where there can't be anything really wrong, all errors can be corrected. And so the error of seeing the untruth and making it important to ourselves more so than our inner calm and peace is the only error that really need to be corrected. Thus, in the correction, we are able to receive our awareness of looking for their holiness or perceiving them through our holiness. So this is going to make sense so long as we practice making decisions in this guided sort of sense that we talked about last couple times ago rather, and being able to see correctly now that we must perceive from our holiness, which is that recognition of the completion of the truth of ourself without any opposition. So God's certainty then becomes something of our awareness, and God's certainty now becomes a strengthening of our mind. So our mind no longer wants to fragment itself in order to project its dissatisfaction into the world outside itself, so that it can judge it to not be his, not to be ours, to be somebody else's. So we're going to learn to minimize the use of time for this, to use time more properly, which minimizes all of time. And this is part of the healing process. So I'm going to go through lesson 167, which explains this in a different way, and interrupt it every once in a while.
Lesson 167. There is one life, and that I share with God. There are not different kinds of life, for life is like the truth. It does not have degrees. It is the one condition in which all that God created share. Like all his thoughts, it has no opposite. There is no death, because what God created shares his life. There is no death, because an opposite to God does not exist. There is no death, because the Father and the Son are one.
So in the realization of that, there is no need for the separation, and there therefore is no need for the concept of the ultimate disconnection, which is death. Because the Father and Son are one, then, is what I want to see for myself. My experience then is the holiness looking to the truth instead of the fragmenting of myself as though I must be represented in separate forms: bodies, people, places, things, situations, and circumstances, all differing and changing constantly. The reality of my truth is that that leads to death. And my reality of my truth is that this is essentially eliminating the difficulties of seeing death as though it is an end of something, an end of life. Remember, in eternity there are no beginnings and no endings. And this is why in the infinite use of time, there is all of time at the same time. In the finite use of time, which is where our physical mind is, which is where our physical body is, there is no infinity either. Infinities now become something that disappear into the great distance, or that come from a great distance. So infinities in time actually occur such that they run the laws of physics, but in fact we don't really see the infinities because we live in finite bodies with finite minds which must die. So this is a entirely different world that is being spoken about here, in which there is no death.
In this world, there appears to be a state that is life's opposite. You call it death. Yet we have learned that the idea of death takes many forms. It is the one idea which underlies all feelings that are not supremely happy. It is the alarm to which you give response of any kind that is not perfect joy. All sorrow, loss, anxiety, and suffering and pain, even a little sigh of weariness, a slight discomfort, or the merest frown, acknowledge death, and thus deny you live. You think that death is of the body, yet it is but an idea, irrelevant to what is seen as physical. A thought is in the mind. It can be then applied as mind directs it. but its origin is where it must be changed if change occurs. Ideas leave not their source. The emphasis this course has placed on that idea is due to its centrality in our attempts to change your mind about yourself. It is the reason you can heal. It is the cause of healing. It is why you cannot die. Its truth established you as one with God. Death is the thought that you are separate from your Creator. It is the belief conditions change, emotions alternate, because of causes you cannot control, you did not make, and you can never change. It is the fixed belief ideas can leave their source and take on qualities the source does not contain, becoming different from their own origin, apart from it in kind, as well as distance, time, and form. Death cannot come from life. Ideas remain united to their source. They can extend all that their source contains. In that, they can go far beyond themselves. But they cannot give birth to what was never given them. As they are made, so will their making be. As they were born, so will they then give birth. And where they come from, there will they return.
So it's only in the illusion of the use of time, or the finite use of time, where there must be space for there to be anything else. It's only there which, in a sense, we pretend that we're living according to a truth. There is no truth in that world. There is just constant change of the seemingly apparent or appearingly what's true. There's nothing that appears, however, outside of herself which is actually true. All of it represents something that begins and something that ends. That's the finite world. The universe itself is the greater representation form of the finite world. Time itself is the greater representation of the finite world. Space, all of space itself, is the greater representation of the finite world. Because time and space seem almost infinite, then in fact we do have a concept about infinite, which we can therefore remember the truth about infinity. The truth about infinity is where we find our right mind. It's where we have a continuity about ourselves, such as that we can't lose it. Whether I fall asleep into almost like oblivion, or I don't remember anything when I wake up, or whether I become unconscious because I get knocked out by something, or whether I, in some other way, lose my physical mind's consciousness for a while. Whenever my consciousness occurs again in my physical body, I realize I'm the same person. This is the use of the finite mind to represent itself as infinite. The finite mind is represented by the mind that makes it, such that it becomes infinite in our experience. Our experience, therefore, is that we have an infinity about ourselves. So if I ask somebody about themselves, they have no concept really of having died already, because they have a current life. They have a concept, however, about going to sleep and waking up. So they have a concept of going in and out of the infinity of themselves by different experiences, each different experience representing a different time, a different place, a different space, and so on and so forth. Something that makes finite reality quite real to us. Now, Robin, you raised your hand. Did you want to ask something or say something?
Yes, Eric, can we expound a little bit on the difference between a thought and an idea? An idea cannot leave its source. What idea is that? What idea are we speaking of here?
Yes. The idea is that there is only one existence. The eternal existence is what really we are. In the idea of the eternal existence of what really we are, there is no other existence. So there's no infinite existence of the separated mind such that it can explore what finite reality would be like. There is no finite reality because there's no infinite mind to explore what a finite mind would be about. The finite mind is the discovery, in fact, of that we can't live in a world apart. So that's the fact of that no idea can leave its source being proven to us. In order to have an infinite mind, which is separate from the eternal mind or God, then in fact our infinite mind would have to create a place for it to be, because it is not in God's mind in its experience. It needs to create an experience for itself. It only can experience the self outside of itself then, and therefore consciousness is necessary in order for it to mirror itself in a reality outside of itself. So the mind, which we're referring to as the right mind, has taken a wrong turn in a sense. By looking for itself outside of itself, it has made a world outside itself by the wrong mind, which is what the Course refers to it as then, because it must therefore dissociate into the experiences outside itself to maintain the awareness of itself outside of itself. It then becomes completely disconnected from its actual reality in eternity. It becomes like another body, and therefore it makes another body for itself to inhabit. So in fact the reality of itself outside of itself is now real to it. So it's a total illusion, like a magic trick. I see myself over there. No, I'm really over here. It's a mirrored effect. Sometimes I refer to it as the mirror twisted reality. And what I really mean is that there's a two-dimensional screen, in a sense, inside of my awareness, such that I now see my body outside of myself, and the two-dimensional screen seems to be in front of me or in back of me or all around me, on which there appears another reality, the reality of the world outside of myself, which I call a universe. In the universe, then, I have to have laws of a physical reality that describe this reality to myself so I can see it inside of my physical brain, which is a projection of my wrong mind. So the whole reality now becomes an illusory reality outside of myself, but it becomes an illusory reality inside of myself first. The projection, though, takes me out of myself so that I no longer seem to maintain a connection within myself with the truth in which I had originated myself to separate myself from. So the Course refers to that as a tiny mad idea, and then the Course doesn't have to explain all of the geometry of it, because there's no geometry in the tiny mad idea. There's simply the idea that I can disconnect from my source. I am the idea of God. I am his extension, never to be separated from him. But in the tiny mad idea, I wonder about how that reality started, and then I begin to drift into a dream of how reality could have started, and I dream into myself, a character to be in the dream outside of myself, and then the dream begins to take form by the separation of information, energy, and light into gases and elements and matter. Then I begin to oscillate between the two places. I oscillate between my mind and what I seem to think is outside of myself, my body. And I then begin to connect the two, believing that my mind is in my body, and I forget entirely that my mind was never in a body, and there is no such thing as a body outside of myself. So it's a very complicated sort of way to think our way through it, and it's only complicated because it didn't really happen, and it can't. What really happens is that, in fact, there is one tiny mad idea, which is simply the wonder about, is there anything else other than this? the correction of it, to see there's an appearance of consciousness for us to look into the mirror of what could be outside ourselves, to see that it would be nothing, and then to return to the innocence of forgetting that idea altogether because it's absurd. That all would happen in one instant of nothingness. There is no nothingness for it to happen into, and so it didn't really happen. The belief that it happened is what this experience is. This experience is of the belief and the interpretation of the belief to make a world outside ourselves. We don't have to know how it was constructed such that the physics of it has to be precisely described for us. Fortunately, humans are not really interested in that very much. Some of us become interested in it, and then we use it to advance science, to reconfigure matter such that it's more to our satisfaction, so we can live the way we choose to live. And then a whole lot of work goes into the use of these physical laws, and we then forget even that even the physical laws are just the reuse of consciousness in a different way, and we don't realize that the laws of consciousness says we don't really need all of this. We need to remain within our inner purpose, which is to realize our truth about ourselves is that we're eternal, not infinite, and we don't need time, and so therefore we don't need a physical time and a physical space in order to see that in fact we don't need time. We simply need this awareness that there is no time, and also the awareness that we have a purpose, and our purpose is to extend ourselves entirely, all of ourselves, to all that is real. When we get back with that, then there's no need to perceive, there's no need to converse, there's only the need to extend ourselves entirely, just like God extends himself entirely to all that is real. Joining in with the creating then. So it's a different reality. It can't be precisely described because there's no precision to it in form. Form is what we use to describe how things are precisely to be understood by a separate set of laws. The laws of consciousness says there is a mirrored effect, and that mirrored effect is my mind in a different use of myself to see that I can make a world outside myself, and that becomes me. So now I have a me that's outside myself, and I have an I that is eternally inside myself. I can't really separate from the I internally that's in myself that I am really, but I can imagine myself to be a me and live in a world outside of myself, which always needs a constant refreshing and therefore a constant change. And so the world appears to me outside of myself, constantly changing and constantly needing to be refreshed. I reverse the process and realize that what I must constantly refresh is the truth about myself, is that I am eternal. As I begin to remember my eternity, the dream outside myself becomes useful, and therefore it becomes a means to the proper end, which is to see my purpose in the world outside of myself, and to no longer be swayed away from the truth. In other words, not to alter the truth. Altering the truth says I can use myself differently, and I don't need to have these simple holy relationship, and I can choose to gratify myself with desires for specific things instead of to know that all specific things don't exist, that all use of myself to educate others and to help others and to be kind and to be genuine and authentic takes me away from the specificity and into the generality, in which I begin to allow the physicality to sort of dissolve away from importance and to see the abstract, which is entirely important to me because it's my eternal place, it's my eternal reality. So I don't know if that describes for you what you wanted to hear, but it made me feel a little better.
Yes, thanks, Eric.
Okay, so let's go on with the finish up about death and how the mind is sleeping and how we begin to wake up in the way he said it here, which is probably a lot easier to understand, I hope.
change what is its waking state. It cannot make a body, nor abide within a body. What is alien to the mind does not exist because it has no source. For mind creates all things that are, and cannot give them attributes it lacks, nor change its own eternal, mindful state. It cannot make the physical. What seems to die is but the sign of mind asleep. The opposite of life can only be another form of life. As such, it can be reconciled with what created it, because it is not opposite in truth. Its form may change. It may appear to be what it is not. Yet mind is mind, awake or sleeping. It is not its opposite in anything created, nor in what it seems to make when it believes it sleeps.
So sleep actually rearranges the neural network. It deletes out parts of things that aren't necessary anymore, and it reconditions the mind and during the course of sleep, so that the brain begins to heal into a new way of perceiving itself or perceiving the world outside itself, and it's supposed to be useful for us. So the proper use of rest then is for strengthening, and in fact the proper use of rest in our purpose of the use of the world outside ourselves does require rest. We must rest in prayerful, meditative, mindful states that allow us to release ourselves from suffering through the process of forgiveness, to realize we let go of all things we worried about and doubted over, and all things that seem to be difficult for us, that we release ourselves from the suffering of that. We allow ourselves to see that we increase peacefulness within ourselves in order to know the healing of the awareness of the effortless creating that we appreciate and enjoy when we master something, and we begin to find that that's where that source of that is. That when we do find something that we love and we're able to practice it to a mastery, that in fact it is that same unifying use of energy, the unifying use of information, and the unifying use of energy then, which takes us out of form and into the infinite use of our mind, which supplies for us now a greater energy even in the body, because there's a lightness to the use of that need for the body, and so there's a lightness to the experience of it as well. And so we essentially are shortening time that would be necessary in order to achieve something. Time is still necessary, though, because of the use of the mind to still carry with it the need for a physical reality. So the mind that is tied to a physical reality will always become somewhat wearied, and so will the body always become somewhat wearied. And so we must learn to use rest for the increasing of our awareness of the need for prayer and meditation and forgiveness, which is really the release of all fear and all difficulty and all complications, all chaos, all confusion, all regrets, and so on. To see that when we're freed of it, we feel the healing of that, and we begin to acquire perceptions differently, such that they fit with the 50 miracle principles that we read when we started the course. God creates that kind of mind that we're learning about. God did not create the kind of mind that needed to perceive itself, and so therefore needed consciousness to reduce itself into a physical object, and therefore to build a vast physical network around itself. The physical reality around ourselves, the great universe, is we can see by various kinds of effects of use of tools. We can see that it's constructed very much like a brain, and it seems to be like almost like a shell. And when we see a picture of the map of the universe, of the energy of the universe, we see a map that looks very much like a skull with a brain in it. And so our reality seems to be based on the truth, but in fact, it's a slowed down, difficult form of the truth in which it's very difficult for us to see our purpose. And so it seems like our purpose is happening, that it's defined in the world outside ourselves. We must connect with the purpose inside our awareness of this infinite mind. Only the infinite mind can remember the safety of eternity, because the infinite mind is trying to recreate it outside itself. However, this is where the problem arises, because now everything becomes a problem. Everything that has to be slowed down into its use, where information, matter, and energy and light are separated out into objects, that makes it much more complicated and much more difficult to maintain, because that is the ideas as though they have been separated from each other. They can't truly be separated. There is only one idea, and that one idea is the entirety of all of the creation as it creates itself. And we have lost touch with that by believing that there's a world outside itself, which in fact we become now unaware of what God really is, and we imagine him, that he created that for us to learn from. Well, we created it for us to learn from, because we are the only ones that are separated. God is not separated from himself, nor is he separated from us. But our imagination has taken us out into a dream of reality, which is separated from him. He's not in the dream. So the opposite of life then becomes death. And so therefore the world outside herself is modeled on that actual existence, such that the existence seems to have had a start for the universe at the Big Bang, or for a person at birth, and then seems to have an end for the person at death, or for the universe when it converges back on itself, as it must do when in fact light is stretched all the way out to its later limits, in which case it must return to itself at its beginning at the Big Bang. So the universe, in fact, seems like it recurs over and over again in intervals, vast intervals of more than 14 billion years, because we know it's that old already, and it's not near yet stretched itself out to that there's nothing near anything anymore. And so the universe will go on for a very, very long time. How long, I don't know. I really couldn't imagine even. So let's just go on with seeing that the opposite can't actually be real, but it can be imagined if in fact we can create something from nothing. So our mind has been condensed into one point, onto which it then opens into a screen that appears as if it's outside herself, but it is really just a hollow, infinite holographic projection outside herself that we call time and space and a universe and a body and places and situations and circumstances.
God creates only mind awake. He does not sleep, and his creations cannot share what he gives not, nor make conditions which he does not share with them.
Robin?
Eric, in trying to apply this course in a practical way every day, you said something here that sparked my interest. The mind tied to a physical reality will always become weary. Can we be anything but that? I get weary trying to rise above everything in the world. And is it possible to even attain that? Or is it okay to just always admit that, yes, today I am weary by what's going on?
Well, with a lot of training practice, we can elevate our thought system, so we think above thought. In other words, we don't separate thought anymore. We allow ourselves to remain within the infinity of the use of our mind, which doesn't require thought. Thought is the separation of ideas. So my idea, your idea, somebody else's idea, it's a fragmenting of the mind into forms of itself. So thought is what forms, and thought forms according to the way I identify with myself as I fragment myself or divide myself. The infinite mind can divide itself. It does divide itself by use of consciousness. It divides itself into people, places, things, situations, circumstances. It is a reuse of what I'm referring to as information, energy, and light. It's the reuse of it to make all different forms. Thought forms are what those are. Thought forms are the planet. Thought forms are the sun. Thought forms are the gases. Thought forms are the elements. Thought forms are made from light, but used accordingly by information to make them real. So information is something that's separated out from light so that it can be used to now form light into the elements and the gases, which then can make things. That's the use of energy. It's the misuse of energy. The misuse of energy is the use of the infinite mind to make itself into forms. That requires the mind to fragment, because some of it's going to be human, some of it's going to be animal, some of it's going to be plant, some of it's going to be mineral, some of it's going to be gases, some of it's going to be water, some of it's going to be fire, so on and so on and so on. The mind can fragment itself that way. You can't remember it because you're dissociated into the body form of Robin. In the realization of your truth about yourself, you begin to see the elevation of yourself into the infinite mind. And therefore, you become less weary even if you're sick. You'll become less weary even if you're working on a problem, because you'll see the problem isn't what is real. You'll see the use of yourself to help others see the problem isn't real is lightening you, is enlightening you, is allowing you to stay within the infinite use of your mind, the purpose of yourself, to see
Okay.
you're here to join with all that is real. And some of what is real seems to be left behind in the physical world. So we're here to make sure that none of it's left behind.
Thank you.
It's a good story anyway, right? Here we go.
The thought of death is not the opposite to thoughts of life. Forever unopposed by opposites of any kind, the thoughts of God remain forever changeless, with the power to extend forever changelessly, but yet within themselves, for they are everywhere. What seems to be the opposite of life is merely sleeping. When the mind elects to be what it is not, and to assume an alien power which it does not have, a foreign state it cannot enter, or a false condition not within its source, it merely seems to go to sleep a while. It dreams of time, an interval in which what seems to happen never has occurred. The changes wrought are substanceless, and all events are nowhere. When the mind awakes, it but continues as it always was. Let us today be children of the truth, and not deny our holy heritage. Our life is not as we imagine it. Who changes life because he shuts his eyes, or makes himself what he is not because he sleeps, and sees in dreams an opposite to what he is? We will not ask for death in any form today, nor will we let imagined opposites to life abide even an instant where the thought of life eternal has been set by God himself. His holy home we strive to keep today as he established it, and wills it be forever and forever. He is Lord of what we think today, and in his thoughts, which have no opposite, we understand there is one life, and that we share with him, with all creation, with their thoughts as well, whom he created in a unity of life that cannot separate in death and leave the source of life from where it came. We share one life because we have one source, a source from which perfection comes to us, remaining always in the holy minds which he created perfect. As we were, so are we now and will forever be. A sleeping mind must waken as it sees its own perfection mirroring the Lord of life so perfectly it fades into what is reflected there. And now it is no more a mere reflection. It becomes the thing reflected and the light which makes reflection possible. No vision now is needed, for the wakened mind is one that knows its source, itself, its holiness.
So that's what unifying is going to be happening in our mind as our finite mind begins to become less important to us, and our infinite mind becomes more important to us as we see our purpose becomes more clear to us. So we need these moments of time during the day, when we wake up perhaps, or after breakfast, or sometime early on, to fashion for ourselves, within ourselves, the realization that our purpose is to make good decisions, to have the kind of day that we want. The more practice that we get with defining the kind of day we want, the more peacefully we can allow ourselves to maintain ourselves during the course of our day, by breaks and by realizing the strengthening of our increasing awareness of peace and kindness and love and joy within ourselves. The easier it gets, and as the easier it gets, then true empathy become something that we can practice. The Course, therefore, is bringing us around to the realization that we really are capable, with some guidance, of making right-minded decisions. So today we'll look at three aspects in the rest of the chapter here: the undoing of our guilt and the undoing of prideful self-will, which keeps us away from humility, which keeps us away from genuine interest in others, which keeps us away from being authentic. And we'll see also that our perception of everyone is changing, and thereby everything in our world is seemingly changing or becoming less stressful and less difficult. And we'll see then there is a way for redemption and of the salvation of our relationships, because we can see now more clearly this joining in the Holy Spirit is bringing together all of the aspects of reality which seem to be making the world outside ourselves, all the information, all the energy, and all the light now becoming unified in one light, in one enlightening experience. The one enlightening experience which now lasts throughout every day, all day, because in fact we begin not to be disrupted, not to be conditioned again by the difficulties of seeing others as that they're egos, and that they're wrong, and that they misuse themselves, and that they are misaligned, and that they disrespect us, and all these things begin to become far, far less important to us. As they become far less important to us, we begin to extend our peace and joy and kindness more so that we begin to find all that is real, which is what, in fact, we need to be able to enjoy, because that's the true connection of our truth in infinity with who we are eternally. Our prayer today, very simple prayer. I've mentioned it before. This is the week I use it. Dear God, please set aside everything I think I know about myself, this book, this lesson, these friends, and especially about you, dear God, so I might have an open mind and a new experience. Will all these things please help me to see the truth? We'll go back to Irene reading for us now in the chapter. This is the introduction.
God or the Ego. Introduction. Either God or the ego is insane. If you will examine the evidence on both sides fairly, you will realize this must be true. Neither God nor the ego proposes a partial thought system. Each is internally consistent, but they are diametrically opposed in all respects, so that partial allegiance is impossible. Remember, too, that their results are as different as their foundations, and their fundamentally irreconcilable natures cannot be reconciled by vacillations between them. Nothing alive is fatherless, for life is creation. Therefore, your decision is always an answer to the question, who is my father? And you will be faithful to the father you choose. Yet what would you say to someone who believes this question really involves conflict? If you made the ego, how can the ego read you? The authority problem is still the only source of conflict, because the ego was made out of the wish of God's Son to father him. The ego, then, is nothing more than a delusional system in which you made your own father. Make no mistake about this. It sounds insane when it is stated with perfect honesty, but the ego never looks on what it does with perfect honesty. Yet that is its insane premise, which is carefully hidden in the dark cornerstone of its thought system. And either the ego, which you made, is your father, or the whole thought system will not stand.
So we're going to go through the rest of the chapter. There are several sections to it, as usual, and Irene has been kind enough to record some of it for us, so we don't have to individually try to figure out who's going to read and all that. And I'll interrupt it every once in a while, and mostly I play it though because I've used more time than I thought I would use in the introduction of my part going through lesson 167. But it's all good, and we're going to see the reinforcement of what we see in lesson 167 in this different way through the chapter.
The gifts of fatherhood. To be alone is to be separated from infinity. But how can this be if infinity has no end? No one can be beyond limitless, because what has no limits must be everywhere. There are no beginnings and no endings in God, whose universe is himself. Can you exclude yourself from the universe or from God, who is the universe? The laws of the universe do not permit contradiction. What holds for God holds for you. If you believe you are absent from God, you will believe that he is absent from you. God has given you a place in his mind that is yours forever, yet you can keep it only by giving it as it was given you. Could you be alone there when it was given you because God did not will to be alone? God's mind cannot be lessened, it can only be increased, for everything he creates has the function of creating. Love does not limit, and what it creates is not limited. To give without limit is God's will for you, because only this can bring you joy, the joy that is his, and that is his wills for you to share. I'll do that again. His, and that he wills to share with you. Your love is as boundless as his, because it is his. Your ability to accept him depends on your willingness to give as he gives. Yet what you will, you do not know. This is not strange when you realize that to deny is to not know. The projection of the ego makes it appear as if God's will is outside yourself and therefore not yours. In this interpretation, it seems possible for God's will and yours to conflict. God then may seem to demand of you what you do not want to get, and thus deprive you of what you want. To say that you are perfectly one within God's certainty is to say that there is no separated consciousness, that God could not observe himself separated from this creating whole, just as there is no separated consciousness in which Christ can observe himself or experience himself as separated. God is wholly all, and all are holy in God's certainty. Bring anything else to the sonship, recognizing your need of healing for yourself, for in this lies the beginning of the return to knowledge. To speak of beings, you, God, Christ, and the sonship, etc., is to misidentify in our mind, is to reduce our mind into a dream of needs, of a world of forms, is to make opposition and duality, is to make a world of fragmented and fragmenting separated forms, and separating identities.
So as long as there seems to be a different certainty, in other words, a possibility of something else, which means there's a different certainty, then in fact, God's certainty seems to be entirely lost from our mind. So our mind may operate as though we know certainty. People like that are attractive. They also tend to be narcissistic because, in fact, they operate according to their certainty easily, peacefully, calmly, and they're very attractive that way. But they tend not to be certain about everything because, in fact, they're not using God's certainty. They're using their own certainty. And so then that tends to get them pretty mad and pretty uncertain about you because they need to find a scapegoat for their loss of certainty. They know they still have it someplace, and you seem to have been what disrupts them from it. And so you got to suffer, believe me, because you're not doing your part to help them keep up with what they're certain about. So suddenly they're not certain about you anymore, but they're still quite certain about themselves.
You cannot be happy unless you do what you will truly, and you cannot change this because it is immutable. It is immutable by God's will and yours, for otherwise His will would not be extended. You are afraid to know God's will because you believe it is not yours. This belief is your whole sickness and your whole fear. Every symptom of sickness and fear arises here because this is the belief that makes you want not to know. Believing this, you hide in darkness, denying that light is in you. The invitation to heal.
Right, that's my part now. Okay, so as we've seen in the Course so far, the Course of Miracles distinguishes between the truth and the illusion. It does it for us. We don't have to evaluate anything or analyze anything. We simply need to read it and read it again if necessary until we understand it. Or meet up with somebody else that seems to understand it a little bit better and discuss it with them. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to see that we are actually always have been free from the illusions of the difficulties of life, which are defined in the Course in their extreme as sin, guilt, and fear. The Course is completely clear about the fact that all error is corrected by the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the answer to all of our questions, and it's only because of the difficulties of seeing that, because we don't understand certainty, that in fact we seem to need to live still separately, while it is we seem to be learning about the truth. The truth can't actually be learned. It is whole and it can never be perceived as anything that we could learn. So in fact we're on the wrong track in a way, but in fact we're on the right track because our learning is taking us towards realizing that the Holy Spirit is whole, and that what we're here for is to join with the whole, in which we become a part of the whole a little at a time until entirely we're awakened as the whole again. So that's the undoing of the errors. That occurs in infinity. It doesn't actually occur in the finite world. The finite world itself is a representative form of the possibilities of how that the healing might occur. The finite world itself is not real. The finite world itself is simply like a magic trick, like a picture that's drawn of the various different ways that, in fact, the whole can be formed again from its parts. The whole is actually represented in science as information, as light, as energy, and as matter, and all of that has to be rejoined again into infinity so we can see that, in fact, all of time and space doesn't exist outside of itself. It exists only in the one instant of the realization that there isn't anything outside of eternity. No idea can pass outside of eternity, really. And so there only can be a dream state of what would reality be like if, in fact, it did occur outside of eternity. If it did, in fact, need to have a beginning, and if it did, in fact, need an end. And so we must discover the means to that end, to the fact that there is a last moment of time in which all of our mind now unwinds itself back to God. And it's like a carpet that was laid out on a two-dimensional surface now becomes available to us all at once without it needing to be stretched out. And that's what the holy instant is like. It's a moment of awareness of the fact that I'm awake, and now I am awake. So the Course teaches about this awakening process, and it teaches us about the relief of our pain and suffering in prayer and meditation and forgiveness, and it teaches all about the no need for perpetuated guilt and perpetuated unhappiness and perpetuated distress and pain. And we're here to learn about the changing of our perceptions and about that we're surrounded by love, really, and we're surrounded by peace, really, and we're surrounded by calm, really. And so we allow ourselves to be integrated into that which is real instead of trying to integrate what's outside of our mind in forms which can never be made real, which will always disintegrate into nothing because they are nothing. They're simply representative, symbolic forms of something that is real. So changing our perceptions about all those things that are around us and releasing them from their guilt, from our guilt really, that's projected on them, then this is the way the Course defines for us the process of learning about forgiveness. And as we release ourselves by releasing others from guilt, and as we release ourselves by releasing others from their false pride, then we begin to recognize God's creativity again. And in remembering God's creativity again, then we see there are no hierarchies of illusions for real, that in fact that's all imaginary. There is no separation of our needs into a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There is simply the truth about ourselves is that we are the extension of God. We are therefore His love, His peace, His joy, His kindness, His fairness, His love without opposition. And therefore the illusion begins to lose its need for form because we no longer have a need for the illusion. To interrupt is just to make a mistake. And just to continue with that mistake is just to make guilt and fear and pride seem real to ourselves, such that we can remain in our mind to be separate, but in reality it cannot be extended forever. It has a limited life form. Because it's limited, it has a limited life form. It's finite. So either sin or God is real. They can't both be real, and they can't both exist at the same time. So long as I believe in the world outside myself that it must be real, and that I must therefore apply myself to the best of my ability to find a purpose for myself which is satisfying to me, then I'm living according to the laws of the world outside myself, the laws of the ego, the laws of a need for a personality and a body and forms of things in order to move things around to create the world in my image of myself. And this is where the narcissist is the most apt to be able to accomplish that by authoritative use of himself to take over the world outside of himself. As it happens, we have a few of those in the world today to see as good models of what that looks like. The more completely we understand the Holy Spirit's thought system, a system in which unconditionally love is based on love itself, and in which all principles are based on that giving is receiving, and that therefore sharing is the extension of giving for the need of those that are receiving, and of then receiving from them the love and kindness and joy of their hearts to see the truth about themselves, then the central message of the Course in Miracles begins to make complete sense to us, is that we thought we were lost, but now we are found, and therefore everything that we have begun to realize is actually part of the creating. We just had been perceiving it, and therefore it appears to us to be different from what really it is. We begin to see that we never really were asleep, that in fact it was just a one moment of the shortest possible duration of a question that never will have an answer. There is nothing that can be different from all that is real. Any questions? No.
The invitation to healing. If sickness is separation, the decision to heal and to be healed is the first step towards recognizing what you truly want. Every attack is a step away from this, and every healing thought brings it closer. The Son of God has both Father and Son, because he is both Father and Son. To unite having and being is to unite your will with his. Healing thus becomes a lesson in understanding, and the more you practice it, the better teacher and learner you become. If you have denied truth, what better witness to its reality could you have than those who have been healed by it? But be sure to count yourself among them, for in your willingness to join them is your healing accomplished. Every miracle that you accomplish speaks to you of the Fatherhood of God. Every healing thought that you accept, either from your brother or in your own mind, teaches you that you are God's Son. In every hurtful thought you hold, wherever you perceive it, lies a denial of God's fatherhood and of your sonship. And denial is as total as love. You cannot deny part of yourself, because the rest will seem to be separate, and therefore without meaning. And being without meaning to you, you will not understand it. To deny meaning is to fail to understand.
One thing that we learned earlier on was that we do have to deny the untruths. So for the time being, while it seems that there is a world that's separate from ourselves, and while it seems that we have no connection with the infinite realization of that we are eternal, then in fact we do have to deny what is untrue. So we will not need to use that once we learn to live above thought, but while we still use thought in its separated forms, such that it doesn't seem to always reinforce the truth about ourselves, is that we live above love. We live in love and above, rather, I guess I should say. Then if it doesn't seem to be occurring to us that way, then we will have to deny the attacks on ourselves, because that is the attack on ourselves. The attack on ourselves is that we're not loved, or we're not loving, we're not kind, or we're not getting kindness, and so on and so forth. Those lies will continue to exist so long as we use thought to support our lower level needs, which aren't really even on the scale of reality. They're below love, they're below kindness, they're below peace. They seem to be the opposite of it, in fact. So we seem to think that we still have a dual nature, which is what the narcissist suffers from. The narcissist can be so perfectly charming and kind and generous when things are going according to the narcissist's plan, and then turn on you just like that, when in fact things seem to be going differently than his plan. But his plan never makes sense to anybody else, because his plan only exists in his mind and his privacy of himself. He cannot share it with us, and therefore every time that we seem not to live up to his expectations of us, he is very, very angry. very, very raging, crazy angry, and we can't live like that. And so we try to tell him that, and he doesn't want to listen to us. He wants us to believe that we can live like that if only we'll learn to do it the way he wants us to do it. And of course, he never can define what that is for us. So we might be able to do it.
Healing is a sign that you want to make whole, and this willingness opens your ears to the voice of the Holy Spirit, whose message is wholeness. He will enable you to go far beyond the healing you would undertake, for beside your small willingness to make whole, he will lay his own complete will and make yours whole. What can the Son of God not accomplish with the fatherhood of God in you? And yet the invitation must come from you, for you have already learned that whom you invite as your guest will abide with you. The Holy Spirit cannot speak to an unwelcoming host, because he will not be heard. You will never rest until you know your function and fulfill it, for only in this can your will and your Father's be wholly joined.
So you need healing whenever or because you don't understand yourself. To heal, then, is to accept without any reservation that there is only one truth, there is only one reality, and there is only one God's certainty, and that must be your will. And so you learn that your truth and your reality is based on God's will, and that there is no other need that you have except to be the extension of his will. Healing consists of recognizing this oneness, and of recognizing, therefore, the recognition within this process that there is only one wholeness, and that you are the extension of his one wholeness. You are his light, you are his peaceful calm, you are his joy, you are his love, and all of that occurs as it is, without any opposition, always. To heal is to unite, to join together, and to wholly know this peace. Healing thoughts move us into oneness with each other in the Holy Spirit's vision, in which case we need no other separated visions. And with this then we align in God's mind, in his willingness and his will, and our willingness then joins with his willingness to increase ourselves always by the creating. The creating is an increasing of the joy and the peace and the kindness and the love, if we were to perceive it accurately. Once we do not perceive it, we simply are all that we are, and we give all that we are to all that is. Since our will and God's are identical, then aligning ourselves with God's will is aligning ourselves with our own true will. This is what chapter 1 told us that God put into our hearts. And this is why I continually say what we must do is take time to reflect upon what we want in our hearts. To be honest about it, we want only love, we want only kindness, we want only peace, we want only joy, and therefore our mind must be aligned with that truth about ourselves, which then allows us to see our true purpose is always to increase the relating of the truth, and therefore to have holy relationships with each other. No relationship then is hopeless, because all relationships then represent the one reality of seeing that in fact we're here to unify all truth in this one relationship.
From darkness to light. When you are weary, remember you have hurt yourself. Your comforter will rest you, but you cannot. You do not know how, for if you did, you could never have grown weary. Unless you hurt yourself, you could never suffer in any way, for that is not God's will for his Son. Pain is not of him, for he knows no attack, and his peace surrounds you silently. God is very quiet, for there is no conflict in him. The way is not hard, but it is very different. Yours is the way of pain, of which God knows nothing. That way is hard indeed, and very lonely. God hides nothing from his Son, even though his Son would hide himself. Yet the Son of God could not hide his glory, for God wills him to be glorious. He gave him the light that shines in him. The children of light cannot abide in darkness, for darkness is not in them. Do not be deceived by the dark comforters. Never let them enter the mind of God's Son, for they have no place in his temple. When you are tempted to deny him, remember that there are no other gods to place before him, and accept his will for you in peace, for you cannot accept it otherwise. Only God's Comforter can comfort you in the quiet of his temple. He waits to give you the peace that is yours. Give his peace that you may enter the temple and find it waiting for you. How do we invite the Holy Spirit? One way is simple. Do so by saying, Holy Spirit, come into my life and my mind. And another way is to extend joy to others.
So, two ways to do it because we're dealing with duality. One way is simply just invite the Holy Spirit to show us all that is real, and instantly then, in fact, we may perceive all that is real to the point of never perceiving anything again. The other way is to join our minds slowly but surely with each other in course of working through what we need to do to find peace with each other, what we need to do to allow ourselves to see that only kindness is necessary, and so on. That's a time-consuming process. Of course, can be shortened as some of us learn to do so better, and then the perceiving can be taught much easier, and so in fact it can be accelerated. This is the same thing as a saying that we simply need to invite the Holy Spirit into our mind to allow our mind to be always comforted. Only the mind needs to be comforted because only the mind retains the idea that there could be harm, because the mind invented for itself a story about itself being abandoned or being rejected. Then in fact it finds itself in a need to work that out on its own, rather than simply allow itself to see that it needn't work it out on its own, that it's been always simplified because the infinite mind already is the simplification of it. The infinite mind in which all time and all space and all possibilities always occur, always, is the simplicity of that. The wrong mind unfortunately can't understand that because it only can make finite realities. Specifics is what it's interested in, and therefore it makes a world in which specifics are so important to it that it forgets its reality of what its purpose really is. Its purpose really is to help us to see that we are one. The ego's thought system is insane, it's illogical, and if you accepted the ego's initial insane premise based on the need for unique identities, then separation and self-creation don't seem to satisfy you, but seem to be real to you. So just decide to change your mind if this happens, and then the ego, something that's made of illusions, cannot possibly create anything that's real, then it seems to be lessened in your mind. Since you may not always think consciously, my ego created me, realize that you do not often believe that you are a helpless victim, a victim at the mercy of the insane world. The ego's thought system is based on the concepts that arise from below awareness in the subconscious mind, and thus we must unify in our higher purpose for the conscious mind, which is never divided from itself, the right mind, which is always unified with the Holy Spirit, in which concepts are not debatable. All concepts lead to the same place, to unity, when they are not debatable. In fact, the world of perceptions was made to hide the ego, so you need help to realize differently that you are making the projections and that the beliefs that arise from that is insanity, and therefore we're using our imagination to make this outside ourselves, and we therefore dissociate into the conditions of this, and therefore, in order to be making reality again, we have to allow ourselves to go through this process of stopping the misinterpretation of who we are, so we can see in unifying who truly we are. And this is where miracle mindedness describes for us the 50 miracle principles, in which we can see just exactly how much our perceptions must change for us to be able to communicate with each other about reality.
The inheritance of God's Son. Your peace lies in its limitlessness. Limit the peace you share, and yourself must be unknown to you. Only you can deprive yourself of anything. Do not oppose this realization, for it is truly the beginning of the dawn of light. Remember also that denial of this simple fact takes many forms, and these you must learn to recognize and to oppose steadfastly, without exception. This is a crucial step in the reawakening. The beginning phases of this reversal are often quite painful, for as blame is withdrawn from without, there is a strong tendency to harbor it within. It's difficult at first to realize that this is exactly the same thing, for there is no distinction between within and without.
So the price for this ego autonomy, or for this maintaining of a world outside of our mind, is knowledge. And it's knowledge of the atonement process then that replaces the loss of knowledge. So we lost all knowledge when we became only dissociated into the conditions of being separated and fragmented aspects of the mind. We are not a mind, actually, we are a spirit. Mind is actually now something other than spirit. In reality, in eternity, all is one, including the mind, and the mind is the extension or the connection or the truth about ourselves is always in the mind. The mind always is on task with that, because the mind is the extension of God also. So there's nothing other than the extension of God, even though we try to describe it such as that we can understand it from the infinite world to correct it in the finite world, so we can stop separating ourselves into the finite world. And in fact, we must have a process for doing that, a thought system for use, and that's what the atonement is for. The 12 steps is the same process, in a sense, for those that are in recovery using the 12-step process. Buddhism is another example of the same use of a thought system to, again, allow any of those that train under that system to allow themselves to be relieved of the fear and relieved of the perceptions that cause them to see attack and defense and difficulties and constant change as more important than the truth. So we begin to see that there are many ways to come to the one truth, but there is only the one truth. The atonement process is how the Course in Miracles describes it. I happen to like it. I happen to be able to relate to it the most easily of all of these things. But I like to see a lot of other things too, because I like to connect the dots for everybody else with me, so we're connected as one picture of one truth, of one reality. So I found that I like to teach the 12 steps. I like to teach Eckhart Tolle. I like to teach the Toltec wisdom. I like to teach a lot of other things as well. And so my fun that I have with physics, and my fun that I have with Course in Miracles, and my fun that I have with consciousness and describing consciousness and so on and so forth, all becomes a usefulness for me of seeing my purpose even outside of myself. seeing my one simple purpose, even outside of myself, my one simple purpose of realizing that unity is all that we really need to work on. Because as we work on unity, it becomes purified for us by Spirit, because we really are Spirit, and Spirit is what purifies the truth for us, because the Spirit is the truth. Let me see here. Yeah, this one.
The dynamics of the ego. No one can escape from illusions unless he looks at them, for not looking is the way they are protected. There is no need to shrink from illusions, for they cannot be dangerous. We are ready to look more closely at the ego's thought system, because together we have the lamp that will dispel it. And since you realize you do not want it, you must be ready. Let us be very calm in doing this, for we are merely looking honestly for truth. The dynamics of the ego will be our lesson for a while, for we must look first at this to see beyond it. Since you have made it real, we will undo this error quietly together, and then look beyond it to truth. What is healing but the removal of all that stands in the way of knowledge? Let us begin this lesson in ego dynamics by understanding that the term itself does not mean anything. It contains the very contradiction in terms that makes it meaningless. Dynamics implies the power to do something, and the whole separation fallacy lies in the belief that the ego has the power to do anything. The ego is fearful to you because you believe this, yet the truth is very simple. All power is of God. What is not of Him has no power to do anything. When we look at the ego, then, we're not considering dynamics, but delusions. You can surely regard a delusional system without fear, for it cannot have any effects if its source is not real. Fear becomes more obviously inappropriate if you recognize the ego's goal, which is so clearly senseless that any effort on its behalf is necessarily expended on nothing. The ego's goal is quite explicitly ego autonomy. From the beginning, then, its purpose is to be separate, sufficient unto itself, and independent of any power except its own. This is why it is a symbol of separation. Every idea has a purpose, and its purpose is always the natural outcome of what it is. Everything that stems from an ego is the natural outcome of its central belief, and the way to undo its results is merely to recognize that their source is not natural, being out of accord with your true nature. I said before that to will contrary to God is wishful thinking, and not real knowing. His will is one, because the extension of His will cannot be unlike Himself. The real conflict you experience, then, is between the ego's idle wishes and the will of God which you share. Can this be a real conflict? Do not ascribe the ego's arrogance to him who wills not to be independent of you. He has included you in his autonomy. Can you believe that autonomy is meaningful apart from him? The ego always attacks on behalf of separation, believing it has the power to do this. It does nothing else, because its goal of autonomy is nothing else. The ego is totally confused about reality, but it does not lose sight of its goal. It is much more vigilant than you are, because it's perfectly certain of its purpose. You are confused because you do not recognize yours. You must recognize that the last thing the ego wishes you to realize is that you're afraid of it. The ego can and does allow you to regard yourself as supercilious, unbelieving, light-hearted, distant, emotionally shallow, callous, uninvolved, and even desperate, but not really afraid. Minimizing fear, but not its undoing, is the ego's constant effort, and is indeed a skill at which it is very ingenious. How can it preach separation without upholding it through fear? And would you listen to it if you recognized that that's what it was doing? Your recognition that whatever seems to separate you from God is only fear, regardless of the form it takes, and quite apart from how the ego wants you to experience it, is therefore the basic ego threat. Its dream of autonomy is shaken to its foundation by this awareness. For though you may be countenance a false idea of independence, you will not accept the cost in fear if you recognize it. Yet this is the cost, and the ego cannot minimize it. If you overlook love, you are overlooking yourself, and you must fear unreality because you have denied yourself. The ego analyzes, the Holy Spirit accepts. The ego's interpretation of the laws of perception are, and would have to be, the exact opposite of the Holy Spirit's. The ego focuses on error and overlooks truth. It makes real every mistake it perceives, and with characteristically circular reasoning, concludes that because of the mistake, consistent truth must be meaningless. The next step then is obvious. If consistent truth is meaningless, inconsistency must be true. Holding error clearly in mind and protecting what it has made real, the ego proceeds to the next step in its thought system. Error is real, and truth is error.
So of the ego, according to the ancient Advaita non-dual philosophy, this world we live in and the space as well as the time is a projection of fragmenting, of conflicting, of limiting thoughts. In your mind, thoughts as well as your physical attributes are really a projection of the conflict of yourself in duality, projected into a state of waking. Advaita calls this projection Maya, conflicting self-doubt, the process of making duality seemingly real. Maya, also we could call it the ego, makes time and space duality experiences appearingly real, hiding from you the peace and the contentment and the love of your eternal spirit. Living in the solution, we discover the Course is a non-dual thought system that awakens us into the higher consciousness of pure non-dual thinking. A semi-non-duality is the way it sort of approaches this. So as we learn, as we go through the Course, we begin to become aware of non-duality, and we'll call it a semi-non-duality, because in fact we still live within the duality as we learn about non-duality. We're taught in the Course to overlook the separating egoic perceptions, the opposition that is of the truth, and Maya is that which appears to be real at the time of the experiences, but does not have an ultimate existence. Our shared consciousness is you and me, and we learn to join then with who really we are as the one I am, and in the one right-mindedness then to see and recognize then only the truth. This allows us to see infinite patience, which gives us immediate results with all of whatever we would contemplate then, to see through it, to see the vision of the Holy Spirit, or to see the truth, or to see reflections of the truth even in the world outside ourselves. In other words, never to be disturbed again by the outer conflict, because the outer conflict immediately is recognized as an illusion of a projection of the idea of separation and the idea of difficulties and the idea of change, which is not real to our mind anymore, and so no longer causes us difficulty and frustration and worry and conflict and confusion and regrets and bitterness and resentments and chaos and contradictions and confusion. Together, guided by the Holy Spirit, in this one solution, then, we are one living in the solution of the Holy Spirit or the Holy Instant. Miracle mindedness, then, does not require us to first that we must love everyone, but requires us to fully realize our spiritual perfection, and then in fact to see that we never did not love everyone, because then in fact we see truly who we are, and we see no need for separation of ourselves into some specific differences or changes that seem to be occurring constantly in the world outside ourselves, because that's what it takes to maintain a world that would be outside of our mind. It must constantly change. And then in order to have any order to it, it must constantly weary us, because in fact it constantly requires a remaking or a remixing of the energy and the information and the light that makes up its reality separate from ourselves. The thought of peace was given to God's Son at the instant that his mind had thought of war. There was no need for such a thought before, for peace was given without opposite and merely was. But when the mind is split, then there is a need for healing. So the thought that has the power to heal the split became a part of every fragment of the mind, and still was one, but failed to recognize its own oneness. Now it did not know itself, and thought of itself of its identity that was lost. So we come then in a daily practice of finding our holy place, the altar of God, which is another way of saying what God put in our hearts. At that moment, then, we offer a little joy and a little peace and a little loving kindness to all that we think about, and then we apologize for seeming to want to see something separate from ourselves and to make it into a kind of desire for ourselves to be rich or to be more holy than others, or whatever way we can compare ourselves to others that would diminish the truth about ourselves, that we are always already whole. We are already always at peace. We are already always the extension of God's love. So the ego's influence then begins to be diminished. Extending this joy then is the process of allowing ourselves to see the joining of each other in this one teaching of the Course in Miracles, or in whatever way other that we develop, in which we can fully trust each other and unconditionally learn that we love each other, and unconditionally actually practice that we love each other. Because seeing ourselves as whole, there's no question about the fact that we unconditionally love ourselves and all that we are in anyone else that we seem to see ourselves to be.
Waking to redemption. It is impossible not to believe what you see, but it is equally impossible to see what you do not believe. Perceptions are built up on basis of experience, and experience leads to beliefs. It is not until beliefs are fixed that perception stabilizes. This course is perfectly clear. If you do not see it clearly, it's because you're interpreting against it, and therefore do not believe it. And since belief determines perception, you do not perceive what it means, and therefore do not accept it. Do not underestimate the power of the devotion of God's Son, nor the power the God he worships has over him, for he places himself at the altar of his God, whether it be the God he made or the God who created him. That is why his slavery is as complete as his freedom, for he will obey only the God he accepts. The God of crucifixion demands that he crucify, and his worshippers obey. In his name they crucify themselves, believing that the power of the Son of God is born of sacrifice and pain. The God of resurrection demands nothing, for he does not will to take away. He does not require obedience, for obedience implies submission. He would only have you learn your will and follow it, not in a spirit of sacrifice and submission, but in the gladness of freedom. Resurrection must compel your allegiance gladly, because it is a symbol of joy. Its whole compelling power lies in the fact that it represents what you want to be. The freedom to leave behind everything that hurts you and humbles you and frightens you cannot be thrust upon you, but it can be offered to you through the grace of God, and you can accept it by His grace. For God is gracious to His Son, accepting Him without question as His own. Who then is your own? The Father has given you all that is His, and He Himself is yours with them. Guard them in their resurrection, for otherwise you will not awaken God, safely surrounded by what is yours forever. You will not find peace until you have removed the nails from the hands of God's Son and taken the last thorn from His forehead. The love of God surrounds His Son, whom the God of crucifixion condemns. Disassociation imprisons us in an unreality, an alternate identity, feeling guilty and fearful by way of specialness. Following a loveless, mad idea, we disconnect from peaceful truth and all-knowing awareness of God's loving presence. Forgetting truth, the story of sin, guilt, and fear separate us, and we see it as replacement for peace, a need to make peace. And thus we fail to see suffering, replace love's perfect peace with serenity. You will awaken to your own call, for the call to awaken is within us. God's Son is saved. Bring only this awareness to the sonship, and you will have a part in the redemption as valuable as mine. For your part must be like mine, if you learn it of me. If you believe that yours is limited, you are limiting mine. There is no order of difficulty in miracles, because all of God's sons are of equal value, and their equality is their oneness. The whole power of God is in every part of Him, and nothing contradictory to His will is either great or small. What does not exist has no size and no measure. To God all things are possible, and to Christ it is given to be like the Father. The condition of reality. The world as you perceive it could not have been created by the Father, for the world is not as you see it. God created only the eternal, and everything you see is perishable. Therefore, there must be another world that you just do not see. The ego may see some good, but never only good. That is why its perceptions are so variable. It does not reject goodness entirely, for that you could not accept, but it always adds something that is not real to the real, thus confusing illusion and reality. The perception of goodness is not knowledge, but the denial of the opposite of goodness enables you to recognize a condition in which opposites do not exist. And this is the condition of knowledge. Without this awareness, you have not met its condition, and until you do, you will not know it is yours already.
So we're beginning to see that anything that we perceive, in a sense, needs to be transformed into that we perceive only everything. So everything then becomes useful for the purpose of awakening. There is no need to perceive anything as separate, as though we have to identify it as separate. We get out of the habit of identifying separateness in any way, in any form, because in fact it allows us to more easily realize our infinite mind, in which there is nothing separated from anything. All possibilities are unifying then in the one use of our purpose to increase the joy, increase the peace and kindness, and to increase the ability to communicate as we are being taught then, either through this course or by any other means, this universal understanding of our oneness. When we make a mistake, we begin to see that we can use the very next moment to return to peace and to return to joy. And this is our healing strength, because this is our way of understanding for the time being, as we use time for this purpose, to see what is God's certainty.
The problem and the answer. This is a very simple course. Perhaps you do not feel you need a course, which in the end teaches you that only reality is true. The Bible tells you to become as little children. Little children recognize that they do not understand what they perceive, and so they ask what it means. Do not make the mistake of believing that you understand what you perceive, where its meaning is lost to you. Yet the Holy Spirit has saved its meaning for you, and if you will let Him interpret it, He will restore it to you and what you have. He will restore to you what you have thrown away. Yet while you think you know its meaning, you will see no need to ask it of Him. You do not know the meaning of anything you perceive.
So that's an early lesson in the Course in Miracles, that we begin to see that we don't need to make a meaning out of things. Things, in a sense, need to represent themselves to us to see there is no meaning in it, and I need to make a meaning of it because, in fact, it's just a representative form of the lesson that there is no need to see and perceive meaningfulness outside of myself. When I ever try to do that, then I ever find myself getting caught up in the reality outside myself and forgetting about the calm and peace and joy and love of the simplicity of myself. My purpose is to communicate the simplicity. My purpose is to increase my joy. My purpose is to understand bliss. My purpose is to communicate forgiveness and healing and the miracles of the miracle mindedness, 50 principles of miracles. It becomes an easier and easier and easier task when I practice getting up during the course of my day, to start my day, to make better decisions, to choose to have the kind of day that I want, and then to use my time wisely and stop whenever I need to in order to refresh for myself what my mind needs to be doing. My mind is what's going to get off track because it's going to dissociate into a neediness of seeing itself as some kind of object of importance outside of the truth. Any object of importance outside of the truth is going to be a concept which needs to be elevated above thought to the realization of that it's here for increasing love, not for decreasing awareness. Don't dissociate into the neediness of seeing the importance of objects outside of yourself as though they're more real than what in fact the truth is made of. The truth is not made of those objects. The truth is the realization that those objects are only here for the purpose of reminding me that there is a better world in the reality of everything in unity.
Not one thought you hold is wholly true. The recognition of this is your firm beginning. No one can withhold truth except from himself. Yet God will not refuse you the answer He gave. Ask, then, for what is yours, but which you did not make, and do not defend yourself against truth. You made the problem God has answered. Ask yourself, therefore, but one simple question. Do I want the problem, or do I want the answer? Decide for the answer. You will have it, or you will see it as it is, and it is yours already. In the real world, there is no sickness, for there is no separation and no division. Only loving thoughts are recognized, and because no one is without your help, the help of God goes with you everywhere. As you become willing to accept this help by asking for it, you will give it because you want it. Nothing will be beyond your healing power, because nothing will be denied your simple request. What problems will not disappear in the presence of God's answer? Ask them to learn the reality of your brother, because this is what you will perceive in him, and you will see your beauty reflected in his. If you perceive offense in a brother, pluck the offense from your mind. Thank you for joining us.
I'm surprised you didn't laugh about that because when we first started talking about plucking this from our mind, we used to laugh like crazy. So anyway, break the magic spell of the layered social conditioning. It's not that difficult if, in fact, you allow yourself to use your time wisely. Do make decisions to increase your joy, to increase peace, to increase your kindness, to increase your generosity, or at least your compassion and your tolerance for others, and allow yourself to see, in fact, that their difficulties and confusion and chaos isn't something that you need to join into, that in fact you take that instead into the realization that you don't know how to cope with it, you don't know what it's for, and you ask the Holy Spirit to show you how in fact you can be peaceful and calm, and therefore escape from that prison of needing to commiserate and needing to share war stories and to be caught up in suffering and that it's real. Get away from that as soon as possible. Even if you're there with them, get away from it in your mind. Return to the realization that you always need the peace and relaxed sense of about yourself, a comfort within yourself, to face any reality, whether it's real or not. This is what we are. We are peace and we are kindness and joy. We needn't be anything else. So ask the Holy Spirit for help with your decisions. Choose God and be vigilant against making wrong-minded choices. Share this knowledge to the best of your ability with others. We must teach what we must learn, and we learn the difference then between what is best and the separation thought system. Filling our minds with healing thoughts, with joining thoughts, with loving thoughts, with kindness thoughts, we make progress. And this is what we do then to have a period of time to make decisions that are more right-minded, and to have other periods of time where we reflect upon that in prayer and mindfulness and meditation perhaps, so it increases during the course of each day. Some other things at the end here to note if you want to use for additional resources that reinforce this chapter. Next time we're on chapter 12. We continue along through the chapters up through chapter 19, I believe, before we take another short break before we enter in part 3. Part 3 is the last 10 or 12 chapters of the text. And I'll just turn off the recording now, and we can still share if we want to.